It's the midweek edition of Business Morning. 55 minutes of current and relevant business conversations. That's what we have prepared for you. Good morning, everyone. I'm Ini John Mekwa. Let's start business from the global space as usual. We can tell you that oil prices rose almost 1% again in early trade on Wednesday, extending the prior day's gains as investors weighed a fresh round of sanctions on Iran, a drop in U.S. crude stocks, and softer tone from President Donald Trump. I never thought you would hear that so soon, both on the Federal Reserve and also on China. So the market found support after Trump backed off from threats to fire Fed Chair Jerome Powell, and after days of intensifying criticisms of him for not cutting interest rate. Trump also signaled the possibility of lower tariffs for China. That's it. But let's look at the numbers at this time. We see Brent rose 61 cents. That's almost 1%. To $68.05 a barrel. WTI is also up 0.94% to $64.27 a barrel. The United States issued fresh sanctions targeting Iranian liquefied petroleum gas and crude oil shipping magnate Said and his corporate network. That happened yesterday. Said's network is responsible for shipping hundreds of millions of dollars worth of Iranian LPG and crude oil to foreign markets, according to the Treasury. Meanwhile, the U.S. crude oil inventories fell by around 4.6 million barrels last week, according to market sources, citing American Petroleum Institute data. And still in that industry, but Nigeria now, the gas output increased by 15.6% month on month to 227.93 million standard cubic feet in March. This is according to the latest report from the Nigerian Upstream Petroleum Regulatory Commission, NUPRC. However, on a year-on-year basis, the country's gas output rose marginally to 227.931 last month from 198.35 recorded in the same period last year. The NUPRC gas production status report also indicates that of the total of 227.93 million standard cubic feet of gas produced in March, 119.55 was associated, while 108.37 was non-associated gas. And this, of course, will feed into the revenue of the country. Well, coming from the meetings going on in Washington now, the International Monetary Fund projects Nigeria's economy will grow by 3% in 2025, rising to 2.7% in 2026, according to its April 2025 World Economic Outlook report. The IMF expects inflation to average 26.5% this year, but surge to 37% next year, 2026. And this is despite a temporary decline from 33.2 in 2024. While acknowledging ongoing reforms, the IMF warns that inflationary pressures and economic volatility could persist without strong policy implementation. The National Information Technology Development Agency, NITDA, plans to set up a National Council for Digital Innovation and Entrepreneurship, which will serve as the highest advisory body for the nation's startup ecosystem. NITDA's Director of Corporate Communications and Media Relations, Hadiza Umar, who made this announcement in a statement, says that the agency intends to convene a startup consultative forum on April 28 to nominate members from the tech ecosystem for the Startup Council. She said the initiation, convened under the Nigeria Startup Act, reflects the federal government's commitment to positioning startups as vital contributors to building an innovation-friendly environment. The Nigeria Startup Act was signed into law October 2022 to create a legal framework and provide incentives for the development of startups in the country. And Nigeria's insurance industry grew by 61% year on year to 1.2 trillion naira in the third quarter of last year, up from 742 billion recorded in the same period of the previous year, 2023. The chairman of the Nigerian Insurers Association, Mr. Kunle Ahmed, who made this known during the quarterly media briefing in Lagos, explained that the non-life business grew by 69%, largely driven by fire and oil and gas business, while the life business grew by 45%, largely driven by group life policy. He expressed optimism that the growth recorded in the third quarter of 2024 will be sustained till the end of the year. While commenting on the enforcement of the third-party policy, the NIA chairman says that a slight growth in third-party policies has been recorded since the pronouncement, which has also led to a slight growth in liabilities of insurance companies in terms of providing more reserves to meet claims that will happen in the future. And the drive to enhance transparency and fiscal responsibility in the aviation sector has recorded yet another win, as the Institute of Chartered Accountants of Nigeria have constituted an aviation chapter. According to the president of ICANN, the birth of the aviation chapter will further drive financial impact in the aviation sector.
Our roles as chartered accountants have never been more critical in our rapidly evolving world, characterized by technological advancements and economic fluctuations. As guardians of financial integrity, we are entrusted with upholding the highest standards of professionalism and providing insightful guidance to navigate these complexities, ensuring sustainable growth and responsible financial practices. That's why they say accountants are not easy, they don't easily spend. They look before they leap. Recognizing the pivotal role of the aviation sector through its direct GDP contribution, facilitation of trade and job creation, the contribution of chartered accountants to effective financial management is deemed indispensable to the sustained growth of the sector and its increasing impact on the national economy. It is my warmest appeal to the first executive committee, the pioneer ESCO of this chapter, to dedicate themselves to providing innovative leadership. This leadership should empower our members with the requisite tools and knowledge to consistently generate significant financial impact and contribute to the overreaching prosperity of the aviation sector.
With the theme Flight Path to Financial Excellence, integrating strategies, systems, and standards is aimed at fostering continuous professional development, knowledge sharing and network, and the ethical leadership in aviation finance.
Without strategic clarity, no organization can truly soar. In aviation and the airport space, our financial strategies must align with operational goals, infrastructure development, safety imperatives, and increasingly sustainability targets. Financial planning must be proactive, data-driven, and agile, able to respond to the volatility that defines our industry. Next, we must strengthen our systems, our engines for performance. From enterprise resource planning platforms to revenue automation tools, we must harness digital infrastructure to improve accuracy, transparency, and speed. Systems integration enables us to connect commercial operations, procurement, budgeting, and audit trails seamlessly. Finance is no longer a back office function. It has become a strategic cockpit. And then come standards, our altitude limiters and stabilizers. In aviation, we respect airworthiness standards. In finance, we must embrace governance, internal control frameworks, compliance with internal control over financial reporting, IPSAS as well, which is the International Public Accounting Standards, IFRS, and international best practices.
Now to other issues. In 2023, non-oil export generated just about $4.8 billion, with raw commodities like cocoa, cashew, sesame accounting for 80%. Nigeria exported 280,000 tons of cocoa that year, 2023, at about $1,000 per ton, generating about $1.1 billion. However, processed cocoa, processing into chocolate, butter, powder, could sell for up to about 5,000 per ton. Cote d'Ivoire shows us how that's done. They process 33% of cocoa and they earn over 3.8 billion from their exports. Now, the Raw Materials Research and Development Council, the bill, is supposed to bring Nigeria to that path. But of course, there are voices that have said that path may not be that straightforward. We have the Chief Executive Officer of Center for the Promotion of Private Enterprises, Dr. Muda Yusuf, right here in the studio to share his thoughts on this. Dr. Yusuf, good morning and welcome to the program.
Thank you, Ini. Thank you.
Yeah, so we got that your release, and you're not in favor of this bill that is compelling exporters to add at least 30% value to any raw materials before exporting it. So could you tell us why? Because on the surface, it does seem like if we add value, we make more money.
Yes. On the face of it, it's a very good policy. And there's a whole lot of benefits in local value addition. But the process has to be very strategic. It has to be very inclusive. And it has to be done in a way that you don't penalize any particular segment of the economy to support the other. Now, when we are talking about a proposal to ban the export of raw materials, unless you add minimum of 30%, local value addition. The challenge is that this kind of policies needs to be contextualized within the capacity to process. There's also the challenge of generalization. For some of those raw materials, perhaps you have some local capacity to process up to that 30%. But for some of them, we don't have any. So this thing has to vary from product to product. It also has to vary according to the capacity to process. Take, for instance, if you talk about wood and the furniture industry, we have a very robust furniture industry in this country. If you say that we should not export raw wood, that is fine, because you have the capacity. But if you take things like cashew nuts, sesame seed, ginger, and all of these things.
About cocoa?
Cocoa, we have some fair capacity as well. But again, we need to look at the capacity vis-a-vis the production, because when we are talking about the economic policy, you need to also worry about all the key stakeholders involved. There are people involved in the exporting of the raw materials. They're also creating jobs. They have a very long value chain. There are people in processing. The whole idea is to ensure that every player in the economy benefits from it. There's also the issue of competitiveness of those who are in processing. Because the issue of processing in the economy is not so much about the availability of raw materials. It is more about the prohibitive cost of production. How competitive will you be even if you process it? So these things are very critical. You know what production is here. You know what the cost of energy is, what the cost of fund is,
so for
the
you
cost
now,
of logistics.
What should the law look like? What should the proposed law look like?
The point is that this is a trade policy issue. And normally, these things rest within the domain of fiscal policy. You don't go and legislate fiscal policy. Just like these tariffs. You don't legislate tariffs. You don't legislate bans. It is in the realm of regulation. From time to time, that is why every year we have this Finance Act, where tariffs are varied, where items are adjusted, where some items are put under import prohibition and things like that, depending on capacity. So for a trade policy, the framework has to be flexible. But once you make it a law, it becomes inflexible. And you cannot calibrate as the condition demands. So it's not a legislative issue. We already have a whole lot of things. I mean, how did the capacity of cement, how did it grow to what it is today? It's not necessarily about banning. It's about, gradual policy process, increasing tariff and all of that. Now we are where we are today. If you say that nobody should import cement, nobody will lose any sleep about it. Look at where we are now with refining. If you come up with a policy now that there should be no more importation of petroleum products, we are good. So we need to watch it. We need to be very strategic. We need to have facts. Because this things has to be evidence-based. You need to have a very robust study of the capacity to process. When you talk about many of these people are SMEs. Their own is to aggregate, get these things. They don't have the capacity on their own to aggregate and go and process. So there must be investors ready to take up the market, to do the off-taking. So it requires a very inclusive process.
So it sounds to me like the proposal on banning the solar panels also, because we did get someone who is into renewable energy, and they are not happy if the government would ban solar, but the government is saying that they want to build domestic capacity. So perhaps what you're saying is, can they make the environment, maybe conducive enough for those SMEs to be involved in adding value before the bill or the law comes?
That is what it should be. And we also need to worry about policy sequencing and policy coordination. This thing is coming from the Raw Material Research and Development Council. And to start with, the core mandate of that agency is raw material research. It's not for you to come with proposal as to what to ban, what not to. It's raw materials research and development. And in any case, anything that has to do with trade policy, the finance ministry, which is in charge of fiscal policy, has to be firmly on board. The Ministry of Industry, Trade and Investment has to be firmly on board. The Ministry of National Plan has to be on board. And in this particular case, the Nigeria Export Promotion Council is not even being carried along.
So maybe the raw material development or research and development, maybe they find that the raw materials they're supposed to use is being exported out. Perhaps that's their concern.
It is their own to do research. You go to industries, look at their raw materials, see how you can improve on the raw materials they are using, see how you can come up with innovative research on alternatives to bring down their costs. That is the core mandate of that council. But again, just as I said, in principle, it is fine to add value. But we should avoid generalization. We should avoid policies that will offset other investors in other segments of the economy. And we should make policy very, very inclusive.
So, I mean, what you're saying now is this should not even be with the lawmakers, because it shouldn't be a law. It should be a regulatory policy based on products by products and capacity.
Capacity to process. That is what it should be. So and normally, that is the way trade policies are calibrated. You can see the way Trump is throwing about tariffs here and there.
Can we not go to President Trump? Because this morning I have another story and all that.
That flexibility must be there. Of course, the finance ministry and the trade and investment ministry, they will take a holistic look at the entire economy. They make the right kind of consultation before they take steps along those regulatory procedures. That is the way it should be. We don't want an environment where an agency of government will just stand up, go to the National Assembly, begin to propose bills that has far-reaching implications without due consultation, without carrying along some critical arms of government that should be part of it.
So what do you think should be done now? Because from what I hear, they've done public hearing, they've gone, a bit further in getting this bill into law. I know we are having this conversation now. How can we, bring this other perspective into the conversation?
Well, what we are discussing now is bringing it, that perspective. I'm sure some of them are listening. And some of the stakeholders are also preparing to make presentations to the National Assembly. Some of the agencies of government are also consulted, although they are not coming up publicly. They're also making their reservations known to the appropriate authorities. But clearly, this is not a bill that should go forward. It requires a lot more, more rigorous thinking, evidence, research, and study. And it is, again, not even a legislative issue. It's a regulatory issue. You don't have to go to National Assembly to be legislative. I mean, where are you going to start from? And apart from that, you are going to lay another set of hurdles. If you want to export now, how do you determine 30%? You have to go to raw material research. They will test it and all of that. How do you go about all those things? And each bottleneck you create for businesses within the bureaucracy. It's additional burden. It's additional vulnerability for corruption. So we don't want too many of these things in place. But more importantly, is to ensure that we do the first things first. We appreciate sequencing. We build capacity to produce competitively. Because you are talking about export. Export is about competitiveness. It's not just about you producing. How can you compete with other countries that are coming to the global market? That is the starting point.
So how do you propose that the policy look like? Finding a balance, because you've also agreed that there's a need in some sectors or with some commodities for something like that to compel, you know, that value is added before it's exported. But in some other commodities, we may not have that capacity yet. So how should a policy look like that can get a balance into all of this?
The policy should be sequenced in a way that you will provide incentives and support first for those in production, so that they are in a position to perform the role of off-takers competitively from those who are producing the primary products. That is very key. If you develop their capacity, and we know what production is in this environment, so that capacity must be there. The incentives must be there, so that they are able to off-take these primary products. If you say we should not even export primary, what of crude oil that we have been exporting? What capacity did we have? Until recently, what refining capacity did we have? So should we now say that we should not export crude oil until you add 30% value? You can see how challenging the policy can be. So it requires a much deeper study, you know, so that you take the right kind of steps and you involve the right kind of people, and you ensure the right kind of sequence. More importantly, is to build capacity, support production, support industrialization, give them the right kind of funding, provide energy, logistics. These are things that you need to put in place. Otherwise, even if you succeed in adding the value, you will not be able to sell the product.
Because of competition?
Because of competition.
All right.
These are issues.
All right, Dr. Muda Yusuf, Chief Executive Officer of Center for the Promotion of Private Enterprises. Thank you so much. And, well, hopefully they are listening and we'll get response to some of these conversations.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. All right, let's take a break now. When we come back, Dr. Yusuf just talked about industrialization. We'll delve into that. One of the possible models. That's our next conversation after the break. To stay with us. Welcome back. You're still watching Business Morning on Channels Television. Now, the Infrastructure Concession Regulatory Commission, ICRC, is the primary regulatory body for PPPs, that's public-private partnership in Nigeria, to ensure transparency and efficient project implementation. PPPs, of course, involve public agency and private entities collaborating to deliver public service or facilities, sharing risks and rewards. Of course, we've had a couple of attempts at making this work. How many benefits or results do we have? We'll delve into that next with Professor George Nwango. He's the managing partner at Ratio Consulting. Prof, good morning and welcome to the program.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
So from where you sit, how successful have the attempts at PPP been in Nigeria so far?
That's a very delicate question to ask, because what we have, I will rate it moderate. Moderate in the sense that there are some successful, some not too successful. If you look at the very large projects in maybe the Lekki Toll Road PPP project, that functioned for a while before government had to buy up the concession. And if you look at the MMA2 airport concession, that is also functioning, but we have legal issues. The legal disputes between the concessionaire and the government. But if you then look at the power sector, especially the hydropower plants that were concessioned to two concessionaires. There are two major hydropower plants that we have, the Kainji, Jeba, and the Shiroro. if you look at those two projects, you'll say they've been very successful concessions. But the most important thing that I take away is that, at least at the end of the day, those assets remain. We have assets. Imagine if you look at the MMA2 airport concession, we would never have had such very good infrastructure without PPPs. But of course, there are issues that we need to resolve here and there. So very moderate. A lot needs to be done better, but we've had some success, yes.
So, I mean, I would have loved to ask, I mean, all of that you talked about is mostly infrastructure, but, you know, we also have food security, and it would have been good to see some of those, even if it's moderate success, you know, in agriculture, you know, when we have this partnership in agriculture, but it doesn't seem like that's an area of interest for the government or the country at this time.
There's been one major concession in the agriculture sector, which is the concession of the silos. So government, if you recall, government had a lot of agro silos. They built these grain silos across the country, and they were lying fallow. And what government did a few years back was to call some private sector individuals, concession it, and what has happened, that has not been very successful, because if you then concession such assets, you need to have, you know, and when I come to proper risk mitigation, you need to, because there are a lot of risk that needs to be mitigated, but it's not. The agri sector appears to be a rather more risky sector, because what you have is, you know, you have, you know, you have seasonal floods. You don't have insurance, sufficient insurance to cover it. The banks are unwilling to lend to the agri sector, so it's really difficult to mobilize financing for this sector. So that's a little bit problematic. But when you then move down up the value chain towards agro processing, there can be it can be more successful, and so maybe that is where we miss it a bit. So yes, we can do a bit more. I listened to your the previous the person you were interviewing previously, and talking about the converting raw materials to processing raw materials to finished products. And it's really where I think we need to pay a lot more attention. And that can work. But down the value chain is very difficult because of risk. It requires a lot of risk mitigating tools that I don't think we have within our financial markets.
Yeah, but Prof, because it has a lot of risks, and you know, it doesn't mean that we should run away from it, because we can hardly run away from the issue of food insecurity. How would you say it could be approached? Even though, yeah, the PPP in agriculture is very risky, but it has to be done. We have to do it. So what model of PPP do you think can be adopted in the agriculture value chain that would give us a more bountiful production from agri?
Okay, and you're right. Risk is the reason why PPPs are very successful, or can be successful, is because it allows for better management of risk. Risk mitigation is key to the success of PPP. So if you look at the agri sector, for instance, one model that comes to mind is concessions. I think the prisons have tried. I think their model is very good. The prisons have a lot of farmlands, and they are lying fallow. And what they've done is to try to approach the private sector, to concession it to the private sector for a number of years. Private sector pays some concession fees to them, and the private sector then uses it to grow a product or produce. The problem has always been, how do we then move it to the next stage? And that is where government policy is important, because one of the critical risks is foreign exchange risk. And I'll tell you how. A lot of agro-processing equipment we import. If you borrow in dollars to import the agro-processing equipment, and your revenues are in naira, the foreign exchange risk kicks in. And once that kicks in, I know a number of businesses that had to shut down due to the management of that risk. How do you then make the dollars to pay back? So if we have a way of mitigating that risk, it can be helpful. Then you have the problem of policy inconsistencies. Governments in Nigeria run in 4-year cycles. So a lot of people try to do things within that 4-year cycle. If you're planning beyond that 4-year cycle, then you might have a problem, because the next government comes in, there's a new policy. If you look at our industrial policy plans and all the policy plans we have, it keeps evolving, it keeps changing. A new government comes in with a new one. So if you've planned that, let's say you want to focus on palm oil production, and the next government comes in and says, we're not really interested in palm oil, we're interested in rice. Like in 2015, throughout the Buhari administration, it was rice. If you then focus on that rice and some of those incentives disappear, then you have a problem. So that also needs to be, that also is a major issue. Risk that we can manage risk better, certainly, but it needs to follow from the government, and then coming up with the right policies and the private sector keying in. And another point that I need to make is that because PPPs can mobilize financing, and that is one of the major things that PPPs will do. But in order to mobilize that financing, you need to have the deals, the big deals. The agri sector typically has very small deals. There are very few of them, like the big industrial plants, the plants that manufacture, make starch. If you look at one of them is in Kogi State, the massive. If you have those sort of massive projects that would attract private sector, large private sector investments, also helps. So it all boils down to having the right policies.
Yeah, and then you also noted that not just you, the issue of policy inconsistency, that is a disincentive for people to even start projects. But I mean, we do have the PPP, as you have noted. It's moderately successful when it comes to infrastructure, and not successful in agriculture. I mean, being a prof and very exposed to the PPP model, how do you think, or what incentives do you think can be added to the PPP model that can make it attractive enough for the private sector in both agriculture, infrastructure, which the government has already started?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And my sense is that we really need to start from understanding what we want to achieve. What do we want to achieve? You need to plan governments should, we need to have a coherent plan, a 15, 20-year long-term plan. Things don't, you don't, things just don't happen suddenly. It happens because of the plan and then the hard work you put in to implement that plan. China became a huge industrial country. It didn't because they had a plan, they had a long-term plan, and they executed. So first of all, it starts from having a very good plan. We've had plans from before 1960 to date, and we've never really executed them, properly. We had the Vision 2020, we had the Nigerian Industrial Revolution Plan. We have, so we have a few plans, but there's never been a comprehensive, cohesive plan, so you put that in place. And then when you put that in place, it then tells you what you want to achieve, how you want to achieve them. So you then, from the procurement process, you then need to design your procurement process in a way that, enables you to achieve that particular plan. I'm not in favor of government spoon feeding the private sector. I think there needs to be a balance. You need to find a good balance because a lot of times you can interfere too much with the private sector, and then instead of the private sector managing risk, they begin to become dependent on government subsidies, government subventions. That's not what you want. You want to create a level of competition. So in terms of managing risk, you must manage risk in a manner that's balanced, that allows private sector do what private sector would do, which is take a bit of risk and you innovate. So you must put a sort of balance in place. And then another problem we've had is giving guarantees. There are a lot of, when private sector, especially from overseas, they ask for guarantees. While guarantees are not essentially bad, they can be very problematic. They can be very problematic. So the way, government needs to also look at the management of contingent liabilities, how it manages contingent liabilities. And I give you an example. Let's say government says, look, we need to procure 1,000 megawatts of electricity. It can say, look, the first 1,000 megawatts of electricity, we will give this, we will give this incentive. And those incentives need to, as the sector becomes more competitive, those incentives need to be withdrawn slowly and taken out so that you create a market-based economy. So for me, government needs to be deliberate in what it wants to achieve, where, first and foremost. And being deliberate, we need to make sure that our procurement process throws up the right people with the right technical knowledge, with the right sort of financing to execute that plan. Thirdly, we need to realize what incentives we need to provide to achieve those things. It can be enabling them by foreign exchange consistently at concessionary rates. It might be enabling concessionary loans. It might be whatever incentive. Then government needs to have a plan to get out of the market. You can't continue to give those incentives because at some point it will distort the market. So you need to know when you take out that incentive so that it's the sector is a level playing field amongst private sector investors. So we need to have a coherent plan and execute that plan.
All right, Prof. All right, Prof. Thank you so much for that. Professor George Nwago is the managing partner at Ratio Consulting. Thank you for your time and your views.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
All right, let's take a break. When we come back, we head to the global scene. Just stay with us. Business Morning on Channels Television. Keep our eyes on the global scene now. Start from the UK. The United Kingdom government's borrowing exceeded official forecast made just last month, and highlighting the fragile state of the public finances even before the impact of the U.S. tariff is being captured into the economic outlook. The budget deficit in the full fiscal year through March was £151.9 billion. This is according to the Office for National Statistics. That's more than £137.3 billion forecast by the Office for Budget Responsibility. So deficit higher there in the United Kingdom. Well, Ukraine is expected to provide its response to a U.S. proposed peace framework during a meeting in London today. The proposal, described as President Donald Trump's final offer on Ukrainian conflict settlement, was reportedly delivered to Ukrainian officials during an April 17 meeting in Paris, attended by delegations from the UK, the US, and France. Sources say the one-page document calls for major concessions from Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, potentially including U.S. recognition of Crimea as part of Russia and unofficial acknowledgement of Russian control over territories captured during the conflict. However, Ukrainian representatives may instead focus on proposing a 30-day ceasefire during the talks in London today, rather than directly addressing Trump's peace plan framework. And other reports suggest that the U.S. proposal consists of 7 points, including provisions on recognizing Crimea as Russian territory and lifting all U.S. sanctions, whilst offering limited security guarantees for Ukraine. We move over to the U.S. now. The latest CNBC All-American Economic Survey found that Americans' opinion of how the U.S. President Donald Trump is managing the economy has plunged for the first time since he entered office. More respondents disapprove than approve of the president on the economy. Tesla CEO Elon Musk, who has been a significant contributor to the Trump administration, has also seen a decline in his and his company's reputations. More than 47% of American public view Tesla negatively, according to the survey, compared with just 10% for General Motors. As for Musk himself, around half of the respondents see him in a disapproving light. Markets, however, are open-minded and often react almost instantaneously to any positive change. On Tuesday, Trump's denial that he wishes to kick Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell out of office, and Musk's clarification that he will be spending less time in Washington, D.C., were enough to send stocks, indexes, and Tesla shares higher, even though we see that Tesla had already lost a bit even before now. Now, U.S. President Donald Trump has signaled a potential U-turn on his trade war with China amid continued market volatility, saying the high tariffs on Chinese goods will come down substantially, but it won't be zero. Now, Trump's remarks made at a White House news event appeared to mark a rhetorical climb down after weeks of tough posturing and tit-for-tat retaliation that sent tariffs on China beyond 145%, which of course everyone has been talking about the potential impact on global economy. We'll see what else President Trump will say about China. Meanwhile, Tesla CEO Elon Musk began his company's earnings call on Tuesday by saying that his time spent running President Donald Trump's Department of Government Efficiency, that's the DOGE, will drop significantly from next month May. Musk, who watched Tesla's stock tumble by more than 40% this year, said he'll continue to support the president with Doge to make sure that the waste and fraud we stop does not come roaring back. After spending almost $300 million in the 2024 campaign to help him return Trump to the White House, Musk created Doge and joined the administration with a mission to drastically reduce the size and capacity of the federal government. He said he will continue to spend a day or two every week on government issues for as long as the president would like him to. Interesting times in the U.S., I guess. Well, still in the U.S., public schools across the United States are facing financial reckoning in 2025 as the federal pandemic relief funds expire and students' enrollment continues to decline, according to data from the Georgetown Economics Lab. The funding crisis stems largely from the end of the elementary and secondary school emergency relief funds, which pumped billions of federal dollars into school districts during the COVID-19. As of September 2024, those funds had dried up, leaving an estimated 250,000 education jobs worth $24 billion in labor in jeopardy. At the same time, public school enrollment has fallen nationally since 2020. In California, the drop has been especially steep, driven by lower birth rates and increased migration out of the states. Out of the United States, now India's economic activity improved in April on strong international demand for goods and services, according to a survey by HSBC Holdings PLC. The Reserve Bank of India paints an optimistic picture, highlighting that the nation's economy remains insulated from global volatilities due to strong domestic consumption and investment. Yesterday at the spring meetings, the International Monetary Fund revised down its economic growth forecast for India for the current fiscal year, citing accelerating trade tensions and global uncertainty. And in Singapore, inflation in March stayed at over 4-year lows, with the city-state's consumer price index climbing 0.9% year-on-year. Singapore's monetary authorities said increases in the cost of food and private transport in March mainly contributed to the headline inflation. March inflation was lower than expected of 1.1%, the same as the 0.9% seen in February. On a month-on-month basis, CPI declined 0.1% in March. Core inflation, which strips out prices of private transport and accommodation, slowed to 0.5% from February's reading of 0.6%. And this was due largely to lower inflation across broad core CPI categories, bearing food except food. And China's major internet companies, including ByteDance, Alibaba, and Tencent, stockpile billions of dollars worth of NVIDIA's H2 chip. Remember the chip that President Trump says need extra attention before it can be shipped to China? Well, they had stockpiled it long before now, ahead of the restrictions. This is reported by Nikkei Asia. And the three companies rushed to secure around 1 million H20 chips, nearly a full year's supply, in anticipation of the U.S. cutting off shipments in April. Smart move, some people would say. Well, this chip specifically designed to comply with U.S. export controls, vital for AI applications, particularly inference tasks. So there you have it. We don't know what President Trump will say next, but Nikkei tells us that when it comes to the H20 chip, well, they have enough at least for a year, and we'll see how long perhaps the tariffs will reduce. But let's head to Washington now. Our correspondent, Sarah Achimigu, has been covering the spring meetings. Yesterday was an important one. All those cuts of economic forecast growth came from her. Let's take her report now before we leave the program.
Officials of the International Monetary Fund arrived the World Economic Report briefing. They are led by the chief economist of the IMF. Per Oliver Orinchas.
Consumer confidence coming down.
He starts by reeling out the state of the global economy, recalling the recent tariff hike by the U.S. and its impact on trade and world economy.
Since late January, many tariff announcements have been made, culminating on April 2nd with near universal levies from the United States and counter-responses from some trading partners. Now, while global growth remains well above recession levels, all regions are negatively impacted this year and next. And the global disinflation process continues, but at a slower pace, with inflation revised up by 0.1 percentage point in both years. These trade tensions will greatly impact global trade. We project that global trade growth will be more than cut in half, from 3.8% last year to 1.7% this year.
And then he gives a picture of the state of the economy in sub-Saharan Africa. Part of the projection include the fact that regional growth of 4% will ease in 2025. This is just as more investment in healthcare, infrastructure, education, and international cooperation is advised.
In Africa's case, basically what we would see is a demographic dividend coming from having a young population. And the question then becomes how best to leverage that, how best to use that and channel it into growth. And the answer there, first and foremost, depends on the structural reforms, the investment that's necessary on healthcare, on education, on human capital more generally, and also international cooperation.
And we have certainly seen...
The next briefing by the IMF focused on the Global Financial Stability Report. The session highlights global financial risk and the need for Nigeria and sub-Saharan Africa to key into reforms that will guard against shocks and risk.
During a time where global financial markets is volatile and risk appetite in particular is wavering, this is when we might see increases in sovereign spreads that will challenge the external picture for Nigeria as well as other frontier economies.
From all appearances, reforms from both the monetary and fiscal sides continue to form the basis for economic resilience as the global market may face more challenges in the days ahead. From the headquarters of the International Monetary Fund in Washington, D.C., Sarah Chimugu, Channels Television News.
Sarah, busy there in Washington, gathering all the stories and from the meetings going on there, and we'll get updates, of course, as she sends them in. For now, that's it for Business Morning. Thank you so much for being a part of the program. I'm back in about 2 hours, 1 p.m. for Business Incorporated, and I'll give you updates from the world of business. I'm Ini John Mekwa. Talk to you later.